It really feels like we're sort of summoning that word off the page, kind of pulling it out of this zone of colonial logocentric inscription and then pulling it back into our black bodies and speaking it aloud. That feels quite magical. Bone Library is a process-driven, long-durational performance work and generative installation work involving a process of bone carving. The material that I'm using is animal bones, predominantly beef bones, but also some lamb bones. So using the bones of these mythical beasts of Australian colonial pastoralism and that are also specifically connected to the dispossession of particularly southeastern peoples from our lands. Engraving these single prepared bone fragments with single words from Aboriginal languages that have been classified by the kind of colonial academy as extinct or moribund. That's a word which is extremely problematic when we use it to describe, Indigenous languages. The work is installed in the space over a course of usually 5 to 6 days and then arranged in specimen tables in a way that gestures or mimics colonial museological collecting practices. So it's a work about language loss and reclamation. It's a work about how we consider the artefact and the idea of an artefact within the kind of field of colonial anthropology and how knowledge works, how knowledge is preserved, this acquisition mentality that exists in prevailing colonial knowledge systems. With this version of the work, I'm collaborating with Aidan Hartshorn, one of the curators here at the gallery. And Aidan is a Walgalu man, so he is from the area around Tumut, high country, sort of not far from here. But Aidan and his father, Shane Harrington, who is a Walgalu TC, have been involved in the work since we first started this process with the National Gallery. This is not a project that just kind of roams around and shows up places. Like it's a process-based work. The community relationships and the relationships of knowledge making are embedded in the process. It was Aidan and some other members of the team here and Aidan's dad who went out and gathered a lot of the bones that are in the work. I prepared the other ones. And then the word lists that we've compiled of Walgalu language were compiled by Aidan and his dad. Aidan and I have been working with 5 different variants of that language collected by 5 different white colonial linguists. And a lot of that material has not been worked on in a long time. So there are some sort of very peculiar transliterations of certain words. And based on our knowledge of other Indigenous languages and what the now standard transliterations are, we're kind of adjusting them. It feels really dynamic and like we're getting to actually, really breathe life back into those words and find the correct enunciation like in our bodies as we're saying them and then engraving them onto the bones. Those words have substance. They become substantial in the utterance of them. I feel in many ways that this work being presented in this context, it's the fullest possible expression of this work. That has nothing to do with the National Gallery. If anything, that has been difficult for me to deal with because at its core, Bone Library is an institutional critique. It's a critique of like white museological collecting practices and the deep violence that is embedded in those spaces. So it's got nothing to do with that. It's got to do with the fact that I'm working, with an Aboriginal team of curators. That creates a sense of, deep completeness for me and warmth. I feel cared for and I feel like the work is cared for. The previous versions of the work, audiences have been invited to come to this final action on the final day of the live inscription where they are invited to take a bone into their trusteeship. The idea being that we're sort of, inviting people to disrupt or dismantle this idea of kind of centralised or monolithic hoarding of knowledge. But when the audience arrive on the final day, the index cards with the English translation have all been removed. And there is this kind of void that appears. The first time I did that, it was kind of radical because people got really cut about it. White people had come to the show and had sort of, some of them had shown up every day and were like, they'd made decisions about the ones that they wanted to take home with them, formed these fetishistic attachments to these bone objects. Then there was this gesture done at the end, which was just like, that's not the point. You've memorized the meaning of that word in your own language, but you don't remember what the word in our language was for it. So it's like when you take away the translation, you take away people's access to the thing that they thought that they wanted. There is something revealing itself in that interaction that is very clear, which is, again, like an economy of extraction. This colony has extracted enough from us. And understanding the way that happens on a macro scale, you know, in terms of the theft of land, taking our children, taking stuff from us, taking our bones, digging up our bones and putting them in colonial museums. I think it's very easy for a lot of well-meaning white folks to distance themselves from that kind of violence. But there's not an understanding of the way that kind of violence shows up in the way that you say, relate to me in this space, or the way that you relate to those objects, or the micro level of the way those power dynamics work and the way that they inhabit bodies and inhabit every social interaction that you have. My work is very much about bodies in relationship to space, bodies in relationship to time, to the live moment, to how the live moment provides an opportunity to address power relations in a really kind of slippery and interesting way a lot of the time, because you can do a lot through an object, or you can do a lot with a piece of writing, but there is so much wild potentiality in the space between two bodies, and that's such an important concern throughout my whole practice, is what goes on there.